My name is Claire Beaumont. I'm 33. 8 months ago, I was named the secret executor of my grandmother's estate, a role she chose for me without telling a single person in my family. Not my father, not my uncle, not one cousin. Just me, a sealed letter, and an attorney's office that smelled like old wood and leather on a gray November morning. The estate included a lakeside property worth $1.4 million, a carefully managed investment portfolio, and a handwritten letter sealed in an envelope with my name written on the front in her careful, slightly slanted cursive. When Howard Finch, her attorney of 22 years, opened that envelope and began reading aloud, my Uncle Gerald pushed back from the table so hard his chair scraped the floor. My father's hands went flat on the mahogany surface, perfectly still, the posture he uses when he is controlling something he doesn't want anyone to see. And my mother, the woman who spent the better part of 30 years telling me I was too serious, too independent, too much, looked at me like she was seeing me for the very first time. Not with warmth, with something closer to recalculation. Like she was adding up a column of numbers she hadn't known existed and arriving at a total that changed everything she thought she understood. Before I tell you what was in that letter, please take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if this story is already pulling at something real in you. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I read every single one. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back. 14 months before that attorney's office, to the last real conversation I had with my grandmother alone. Her name was Dorothy Beaumont. Everyone called her Dot. She was 79 years old, sharp as a blade, and she carried herself with the particular kind of dignity that doesn't come from money or status or the right last name. It comes from having survived things quietly that would have broken other people loudly. She grew up in a mill town in western Pennsylvania. Her father drank. Her mother worked double shifts at a textile factory and still came home to cook dinner and braid her 3 daughters' hair before bed. Dot watched all of that and made a decision somewhere around age 12 that she would build something solid, something no one could dismantle, something that would still be standing long after the people who doubted her were gone. And she did. Over 50 years of careful, patient, unglamorous work, she accumulated a lakeside property in upstate New York, a modest but meticulously managed investment portfolio, and a reputation in her community for being someone whose word meant exactly what it said and nothing less. She was not flashy. She drove the same car for 11 years. She clipped coupons until she was 75, not because she had to, but because waste offended her at a level that felt almost moral. She had outlived one husband, one close friend, and what she called sitting on the porch in October with a cup of Earl Grey going cold in her hands, the illusion that family automatically means loyalty. I was the one who drove to see her. Every other weekend, 2.5 hours each way, on a highway that shifted from interstate to county road to the long flat stretch past the lake that always smelled like pine and cold water, regardless of the season. I started making that drive when I was 26, the spring after my grandfather died, when I realized she was alone in that house with its too many rooms and its view of the water and a silence that had changed quality completely now that it was only hers. My parents didn't go. My Uncle Gerald didn't go. My cousins called on birthdays and major holidays, which she appreciated and which she also understood clearly for exactly what it was. An obligation honored at minimum cost. I went because I wanted to. Because Dot was the only person in my extended family who had ever asked me a question and then actually waited for the answer. We had a ritual. I'd arrive Saturday morning. She'd have coffee ready. Real coffee, not the instant she kept for guests she wasn't sure about. And we'd sit at the kitchen table that faced the lake and talk for 2 hours before we did anything else. Not small talk. Real talk. She asked about my work. I'm a landscape architect. I design public parks and green spaces for municipalities, the kinds of spaces that determine whether a city feels welcoming or hostile to the people who live in it. Dot understood what I described in a way almost no one in my life did. She asked follow-up questions on the next visit. She remembered details from months ago. She treated my career as though it mattered, which sounds like a depressingly low bar. But inside my family, it was a height I had genuinely never reached with anyone else. My parents had wanted me to go into finance or law. Something with a ceiling you could see, measure, and put on a business card. Landscape architecture baffled them at a fundamental level. "What does that even mean?" my father asked once, at Thanksgiving, in front of everyone. I explained it. He nodded and immediately redirected the conversation to my cousin Melissa's law firm clerkship. I stopped explaining after that. I learned to contain my work inside myself, the way you contain something you're afraid people will diminish if you let them touch it. But Dot understood. She said once, sitting at that kitchen table with the morning light coming off the lake at an angle that made everything look suspended, that the people who decide where the trees go and where the benches sit and how the light falls in a public space are the people who decide whether strangers feel welcome in a city, whether someone walking alone at dusk feels safe or afraid, whether a child has somewhere to run. She said it like it was an obvious truth that she was mildly surprised more people hadn't noticed. It was the first time I had ever heard my work described that way by anyone who wasn't me. I cried in the car on the way home that afternoon. The long, ugly, relieved kind of crying that happens when something you've been holding alone for too long finally gets witnessed. The last real conversation happened on a Saturday in October, 14 months before the attorney's office. The leaves had turned around the lake, and the light was doing the particular thing it does in upstate New York in autumn, where everything looks slightly more vivid than usual, slightly more itself, like the world is paying closer attention before it lets things go. She was quieter than normal that morning. I noticed it early but didn't push. We drank our coffee. She looked at the water. The silence between us had never been uncomfortable, and it wasn't uncomfortable now, but it was weighted in a way I hadn't felt before. Then she said, without turning toward me, "I've been thinking about what happens after." I said, "Dot, you've got years yet." She waved that off the way she always did when someone offered her sentiment where she wanted practicality. She turned and looked at me then, straight on. She had very clear gray eyes, and they didn't waver. She said, "I want it to go to the right people. Not the ones who showed up when it suited them, the ones who showed up." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which with Dot was almost always the right answer. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her hands were small and dry and completely certain. She said, "You've been showing up for 7 years, Claire, every other weekend. Rain and snow, and that February when you called me from the rest stop on Route 9 because you'd hit ice and you didn't want me to worry. I remembered that drive. Black ice for 40 miles. I had thought about turning back at least 6 times. I didn't because I had told her I was coming, and telling Dot you'd be somewhere and then not being there felt like a betrayal of something I couldn't fully articulate but understood completely. She said, "I've told my attorney what I want. I want you to know it's handled. And I want you to know that what I've left in your hands, I've left there because I trust them." She squeezed once. That was all. She picked up her coffee. We looked at the lake. The conversation moved on. 3 months later, she was gone. A stroke, fast and final. The kind she would have chosen if she'd had a choice in the matter, because Dot had no patience for long goodbyes and very little tolerance for suffering that didn't serve a purpose. The funeral was small. She had requested that specifically. The graveside service lasted 30 minutes. My Uncle Gerald gave a brief eulogy that was largely about himself. My father stood beside my mother with his hands in his coat pockets and stared at the middle distance. I stood at the back and held a cup of gas station coffee that had gone cold and thought about the kitchen table and the lake and the way the October light had looked the last time I sat across from her. 2 weeks later, Howard Finch's office called to schedule the reading of the will. The firm was located in a town 20 minutes from the lake property. Small, clean, established. Wooden blinds. The smell of paper and old certainty that good law offices seem to accumulate over decades. We gathered around a rectangular conference table, all 7 of us. My father, Thomas, 61, retired civil engineer, a man who has spent his entire adult life taking the path of least resistance and arriving somewhere safe and slightly diminished. My mother, Renee, who coordinates events for a nonprofit and has strong opinions about table settings and very few opinions about anything that requires conflict. My uncle Gerald, 67, Dot's firstborn, a man who has moved through the world with the absolute confidence of someone who has never seriously been told no. His wife, Patricia, who has matched her opinions to Gerald's for so long, I'm not sure she remembers having separate ones. Their children, my cousins, Melissa, 31, an attorney at a mid-sized firm in Albany, and Brendan, 28, who works in commercial real estate and is the only person on Gerald's side of the family I have ever genuinely liked. And me. Howard Finch was in his mid-60s, unhurried, with the particular stillness of a man who has sat in rooms like this many times and understands that the tension in them is never really about the money. He opened the folder. He began with the standard language. The investment portfolio is to be divided equally between Thomas Beaumont and Gerald Beaumont, Dot's 2 sons, after applicable taxes and fees. Personal effects to be distributed per the attached schedule, which had already been shared with family members individually. Then he paused. The kind of pause that is not accidental. The lake property, he said, including all structures, contents, and the surrounding parcel of 3.2 acres to be held in trust and managed by the designated executor of this estate. He looked up. The designated executor is Claire Ann Beaumont. The room didn't gasp. It was quieter than a gasp. It was the specific silence of 7 people processing something that had just rearranged their understanding of a situation they thought they already knew. Howard continued. The executor holds sole decision-making authority regarding the property's maintenance, use, and future, including but not limited to decisions regarding sale, rental, renovation, or transfer. All family members who are direct descendants of Dorothy Beaumont retain the right to use and visit the property per a schedule to be established by the executor. No changes to the property's status may be made without the executor's written consent. He set the document down. He said, "There is also a sealed letter, designated for the executor, to be opened at this reading per Dorothy's instruction." He reached into the folder and produced an envelope. My name is on the front. Dot's handwriting. The careful, slightly slanted cursive she reserved for things that mattered enough to slow down for. He held it out across the table. I reached for it. My hands were completely steady, which surprised some part of me that had been braced for something more dramatic. What I felt in that moment was not triumph or vindication or any of the things that might make sense in a story like this. What I felt was the specific, serious weight of being trusted with something real by someone who was no longer in the room to answer questions. I opened the envelope, unfolded 3 pages, both sides, written in that same deliberate hand. Before I read, I looked up, and I saw their faces. Gerald had pushed back from the table. Not standing yet, but his body had shifted into the posture of a man preparing to stand, his chair legs dragging an inch across the floor, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the armrests. My father's palms were flat on the table, completely still, fingers spread slightly, the exact posture he uses when he is managing something internally that he doesn't want visible externally. My mother was looking at me with that look I described at the beginning, the first-time look, the recalculating look. Like someone who has been using the wrong map for years and has just been handed the correct one and is trying to figure out where they actually are. Melissa was looking at her phone. Brendan was watching Gerald. Patricia was watching Gerald. Howard Finch was watching me. I thought, with a clarity that felt almost cold in its precision, she knew exactly what this room would look like when this moment arrived. She had known for 4 years, and she had made her decision anyway. She had chosen me anyway. I started reading. I need to tell you something about my family before I tell you what was in that letter. Because the letter makes complete sense when you understand what came before it, and almost no sense at all without that context. My Uncle Gerald was the favorite. This is not a controversial statement within the family. It is not a wound anyone is still nursing or a grievance anyone is still fighting. It is simply a fact that has been true for so long that the family has collectively agreed to stop naming it, because naming it had never changed it, and naming it made certain people uncomfortable. Gerald was the son Dot had at 22, when she and my grandfather were young and hopeful, and the hard years hadn't arrived yet. My father, Thomas, came 6 years later, after 2 miscarriages and a stretch of genuine financial difficulty that left marks on the family that never fully healed. Gerald arrived in the good years, carried in on that particular warmth. My father arrived in the complicated ones when the warmth had been replaced by something more careful and more tired. And somehow that timing calcified over decades into a family mythology where Gerald was capable and deserving, and my father was perpetually slightly less, perpetually slightly behind, perpetually waiting to be told it was his turn while quietly understanding that his turn was probably not coming. I watched this throughout my entire childhood. Holiday dinners where Gerald's opinions were solicited and my father's were interrupted. Phone calls where Dot would talk to Gerald for 40 minutes and to my father for 12. Money, during the lean years, that moved toward Gerald in ways my father never asked about and Dot never offered him. Gerald's children, Melissa and Brendan, were placed at the center of every family gathering, while my sister Joanna and I were expected to be grateful for inclusion and not ask for more than that. My sister Joanna handled this by leaving. She moved to Portland at 24 and has maintained a careful, deliberate, healthy distance from the entire extended family ever since. She has a good life there. She calls me every Sunday. She refers to me, always, as the only smart one still inside the blast radius. I have never been entirely sure she's wrong. I stayed. I stayed because I had Dot, and because somewhere underneath all of it I believed. The way you believe things you have never actually examined, that if I stayed long enough and showed up consistently enough and was good enough at the things that mattered, the family I wanted would eventually emerge from the one I had. That particular belief has since been revised, but it kept me in the orbit for long enough to be present for the thing that mattered most. Gerald ran the family the way people run things when they have never been seriously challenged. He made decisions on behalf of everyone, announced them as established facts, and expected compliance. When Dot got older and the question of the lake house's future began to hover at the edges of family conversations, Gerald declared, "At Thanksgiving, 5 years ago, over the remnants of dinner, in the tone of a man reading from a document that everyone in the room had already signed, that the property would transition to a shared family vacation home, managed collectively by both families, meaning managed by Gerald, because that was simply the natural order. He said this as though it had already been decided, which in his mind it had. I watched my father nod along the way. My father nods along with Gerald, the small, careful nod of a man who has chosen his battles so selectively over so many decades that he has largely forgotten how to choose them at all. And I watched Dot's face do something very small and very controlled across the table. Not disagreement she would voice. Not in that room, not with that audience. Something quieter than disagreement. Something more like a decision already made. I thought about that moment a great deal over the years that followed, sitting at her kitchen table on Saturday mornings, looking at the lake, understanding slowly, in the way you understand things that have been true for a long time before you have language for them, that she was doing something more patient and more deliberate than anything Gerald had ever bothered to do. She was not reacting to him. She was not fighting him. She was simply making a different plan, in the quiet, in the place where he was not watching, because he had never thought to watch her. I read the letter aloud. Howard Finch had asked me to, for the record. I think Dot had anticipated that. I think she had written it knowing it would be read in that room, in front of those faces, by my voice, and she had chosen every word accordingly. She began with the property. The lake house had been her sanctuary for 41 years. She had painted every room herself over the course of the first summer she owned it, working on weekends with drop cloths and open windows and music from a radio she'd bought at a hardware store closing sale. She had planted the garden on the south side of the spring after my grandfather died because she needed something alive to tend, something that would respond to attention with growth rather than silence. She had sat on the porch through every season of her life. Through the years when the children were young and loud, and the house was full, and through the years when the house became quiet again, and the quiet changed its character depending on what had recently been lost. She did not want it managed by a committee. She did not want it converted into a vacation schedule negotiated by people who calculated its square footage when real estate markets came up in conversation. She wanted it kept, maintained, loved in the specific way that a place can only be loved by someone who understands that some things are worth more than their appraised value and must be treated accordingly. She wrote that she had considered her options carefully and at length. She had consulted with Howard Finch multiple times over a period of 4 years. She had not made this decision quickly or sentimentally or in the fog of grief or illness. She had made it with a clear mind and a full heart and absolute certainty, because over the course of 7 years of consistent, faithful presence, one person in her family had demonstrated something she valued above almost everything else she could think of. She called it stewardship. She wrote, "Claire understands stewardship. She understands that some things exist to be protected rather than used, that some things accumulate meaning over time in ways that cannot be transferred through a sale or dissolved through a committee decision. She has sat with me through every season of this property's life for 7 years, and she has never once looked at it like an asset. She has always looked at it like a home." Then she wrote the part that made my father look away from the table. "I love both my sons. I want that stated clearly and permanently on the record. But love and trust are not the same currency, and they do not always flow toward the same people. I have watched Gerald treat this property as something to be leveraged at the optimal moment. I have watched Thomas defer to him on every matter that required someone to hold a position. Neither of these qualities recommends a person for the role of guardian of something irreplaceable." She paused in the text here. There was a line break, deliberate, the way she paused in conversation when something important was coming. "I have watched my granddaughter drive 2.5 hours through ice and rain and ordinary February Saturdays for 7 years, she wrote, to sit at my kitchen table and ask me questions about my life that assumed my life was worth asking about. In a family where I have sometimes felt more like a balance sheet than a person, Claire made me feel like a person. Every single visit. That quality, I believe, is exactly what a family's legacy requires in the person who guards it. The room was not silent, the way rooms are silent when they are comfortable. It was silent the way rooms are silent when the floor has just shifted under everyone's feet and nobody is sure yet where solid ground is. Gerald spoke first. He said, "That's not a legal document. A letter is not legally binding." Howard Finch said, "The letter is supplementary to the trust document. The trust document is the binding legal instrument. It has been in place for 4 years, properly filed and registered. The letter is Dorothy's explanation of her reasoning, which she chose to share with her family at this reading." Gerald said, "I want to contest it." Howard looked at him with the complete patience of a man who has heard this exact sentence in rooms very much like this one more times than he could count. He said, "You are welcome to consult your own attorney." However, Dorothy was assessed as fully cognitively competent at the time of signing. The document was executed with appropriate witnesses. The trust has been in place and unaltered for 4 years. I would encourage you to speak with your own counsel before proceeding. 4 years. She had set this in motion 4 years ago, had made the decision quietly, had executed it properly, had said nothing to anyone, had continued to sit at the kitchen table with me every other Saturday morning, drinking coffee, looking at the lake, and talking about my work, her garden, and the particular quality of the light in November. Had said nothing except that one October afternoon in the second to last conversation we ever had, when she squeezed my hand once and told me it was handled. My father said nothing throughout any of this. He was looking at his hands on the table. After Howard finished, after the supplementary documents were distributed, after Gerald asked 3 more procedural questions that Howard answered with the same unhurried precision, we filed out into the parking lot. November afternoon. Gray sky. The particular cold that arrives in upstate New York in November and doesn't leave until April. Gerald walked to his car without speaking to me or making eye contact. Patricia followed him, her heels precise on the asphalt. Melissa was already on her phone. Brendan caught my eye briefly as he passed and gave me a small, careful nod that I understood to mean I didn't know, for what that's worth, and I think you deserved it. My father stopped on the sidewalk outside the office door. He stood there for a moment, not looking at anything specific, just standing in the cold with his hands in his coat pockets, the way he stands when he is working something out that he hasn't finished yet. He said, "I didn't know she felt that way." About Gerald. I said, "She never said it to me directly either." He said, "She said it now." That was all. He walked to the car. My mother touched my arm as she passed. Briefly, the way you touch the arm of someone you are not sure how to categorize anymore, and got in the passenger seat. I stood in the parking lot alone for a moment. The cold air had that particular sharpness that feels like clarity. I thought about the kitchen table and the coffee and the October light and the woman who had sat across from me for 7 years and paid attention and made a plan and kept it quiet and trusted me to carry it forward. I was not triumphant. I need to be honest about that. What I felt was the weight of something real being placed in my hands by someone who was no longer there for me to ask questions of. That is not a light feeling. It is the heaviest kind of love there is. Gerald called me 3 days later. I was working at my kitchen table, site plans spread across it for a park project in the Hudson Valley, when his name appeared on my screen. I had been expecting the call. I had been thinking about what I would and would not say. He opened with warmth. The specific warmth that arrives when someone needs something from you and has decided that charm is the most efficient path to getting it. He said, "Claire, I think we all got off on the wrong foot at the reading. This is a difficult time. I thought maybe you and I could talk it through." I said, "Of course." "What would you like to talk about?" he said. "The property. I've always wanted to keep it in the family. You know that. My concern is that what your grandmother outlined is a little impractical for a property that requires real ongoing maintenance decisions. I just think a more collaborative structure would serve everyone better." I said, "What kind of structure are you thinking?" He said, "Shared management. Something that reflects everyone's stake in the property." I said, "What stake do you mean specifically?" A pause. He said, "Emotional stake. Family history. This was all of our family's home. I said that the property taxes for the past 11 years were paid from Dot's account. Do you know who contributed to that account?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "The property taxes, the insurance premiums, the driveway resurfacing in 2019, and the plumbing work in 2021. I contributed to those costs. Not all of them, but a significant portion. Because Dot asked me once if I could help, and I said yes. And then I kept saying yes because the property mattered to me, and she mattered to me." Silence. I said, "I'm not raising that to score a point. I'm raising it because I want us to be working from the same set of facts." He said, "I didn't know that." I said, "I know you didn't." Another pause. When he spoke again, the warmth was gone entirely. And what was underneath it was something older and harder. The voice of a man who is accustomed to being the person in the room that decisions defer to, and who is encountering, perhaps for the first time in a long time, a situation where that is not going to be the case. He said, "You need to understand that this is not how things work in this family." My mother was elderly. She was not always thinking as clearly in her final years as she might have. What she set up may not reflect what she would have wanted with better counsel. I said, "Howard Finch has been her attorney for 22 years. He knew her well. She set this up 4 years ago when she was 75 and as sharp as she'd ever been." He has documentation of multiple conversations with her across the period during which the trust was being established. He said, "I'm going to speak to my attorney." I said, "You mentioned that to Howard." "I understand completely. That's your right," he said. "You should think carefully about what you want your relationship with this family to look like going forward." I said, "I've been thinking about that for a long time, Gerald." He hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. Outside my window, the city was moving through November the way cities do, fast and purposeful and indifferent. I thought about what it costs to say the true thing plainly to someone who has spent decades not expecting to hear it from you. And I found that it cost less than I had anticipated. Maybe because I wasn't saying it in the hope of anything. I wasn't trying to reach him or change him or finally make him see me as something other than a footnote. I was simply declining to pretend. That particular decision, I was discovering, gets easier every time you make it. My father called 4 days after the reading. 4 days of silence, which for my father means he has been sitting with something and working it through in his own way, in his own time, before he is ready to speak. My father processes slowly and arrives somewhere real when given enough room. "It is possibly the quality we most share," he said. "I've been thinking about what she wrote." I said, "I have too." He said, "The part about me deferring to Gerald." I didn't respond to that. I let it sit. He said, "She's not wrong." He said it the way people say things they have known for a long time and have not allowed themselves to say out loud. Flat and factual and carrying the specific tiredness of a truth that has been kept waiting. I said, "I know." He said, "I didn't know she saw it that clearly." I said, "She saw most things clearly. She just chose when to say them and to whom." He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, "Was it strange? Going every other weekend for all those years? I always wondered why you kept at it." I said, "I kept going because I wanted to. Because she was interesting and she cared, and the conversation was worth the drive every single time." He said, "She left you something real." I said, "Yes." He said, "A responsibility." I said, "Yes." Silence. Then he said, "I'll support whatever you decide to do with it." That was all. But it was the first time in my adult life that my father had said he was behind me without first checking which direction Gerald was facing. It was a small statement and a significant one, and I held it carefully, the way you hold small, significant things when you have learned not to take them for granted. The legal challenge Gerald filed went nowhere. His attorney sent a letter in January questioning the competency assessment and raising questions about the timing of the trust formation. Howard Finch responded with documentation. Dot's medical records across the years surrounding the signing showed a woman in complete cognitive health. The independent witnesses were a notary with 20 years of practice and a retired judge she had known personally for 3 decades. The trust had been properly filed, registered, and unaltered for 4 years. Gerald's own attorney, to his credit, told him plainly that there was no viable case to bring. Gerald paid the retainer and received nothing for it but the bill and the knowledge that he had tried. In February, I drove to the lake house for the first time since the reading. The property in winter looks the way I imagined Dot looked when she was young. Spare. Certain. Not softened by anything seasonal yet. Not asking for anything. Simply there. The lake was partially frozen. Gray-green ice working in from the edges. Dark open water still moving at the center. The garden on the south side was bare. The canes wrapped in burlap the way she always prepared them in October. The way I had watched her prepare them 3 times across the years I visited in autumn. The porch was exactly as she'd left it. Her chair, the one she always sat in, with the faded blue cushion she had refused to replace for 20 years because it had shaped itself to her exactly right, and she saw no reason to start over. I sat in her chair. It was cold. I didn't care. I stayed there for a long time, looking at the water, watching the ice work its patient way toward the center from the edges, the way she used to describe it in February letters she wrote me when I was in college. Always from the edges inward, she wrote once. The lake freezes the same way trust does. Slowly, from the outside in, and only if the temperature holds. I thought about stewardship, about what it actually means to be trusted with something someone spent their entire life building. Not ownership, not control. Stewardship. The difference between those things is everything. I thought about the garden in spring, about the porch in July, about what it would look like in October again when the leaves turned and the light did that particular thing. I thought about who I wanted sitting at that kitchen table in the years ahead and who had earned the right to that view, and what it would mean to make those decisions from a place of love rather than obligation or leverage or the complicated math of family politics. Here is what I decided. And I want to tell you this part slowly because it is the part that matters most to me. I did not close the property to Gerald's family. I did not change the locks or declare the house off limits or use the authority I had been given as a tool of exclusion or punishment. That is not what Dot asked me to do. She did not give me this to use as a weapon. She gave it to me to protect, to keep it from being dismantled, to ensure it remained what it had always been. A place where the family could still come, still sit on that porch, still watch the lake freeze from the edges inward, without being leveraged or sold or managed into something functional and empty. So I wrote a document, a use agreement, plain and clear, that Howard Finch reviewed and approved. The property was available to all direct descendants of Dorothy Beaumont for visits and stays, scheduled through a shared calendar that gave all families equal access across the seasons. Costs were shared proportionally based on usage. No single family held claim to any specific period. No decisions regarding the property's maintenance, improvement, structure, or future status could be made without the executor's written agreement. And the property could not be sold, mortgaged, or used as collateral in any financial arrangement, for any reason, by anyone. That last clause was the one that mattered most. Because what Gerald had actually wanted was never really the lake house. The lake house was not the point. What Gerald had wanted was the asset. The ability to hold it as collateral, to sell it when the moment was financially optimal, to make the practical, efficient decision that he had long ago privately concluded was the obvious one. He had visited in July for a week most summers and spent those weeks calculating the property value and imagining what it could become if handled correctly, meaning if handled by him. He had never sat on that porch in February. He had never driven through an ice storm to be there. He had never planted anything in that garden or watched something he planted come back the following spring. He wanted the number. Dot knew that. And she had spent 4 years making sure the number was not his to reach for. When I sent the use agreement to all family members in March, Gerald did not respond directly to me. Patricia sent a 2-line email saying they would review the document with their attorney. Melissa sent a thumbs up, which I chose to read as genuine. Brendan called. He said, "Honestly, this is fair. More than fair, actually." I told him I appreciated that. More than I let on. My father called and said she would be pleased. 4 words. But I heard something underneath them that I had not heard from him in a very long time. Something that sounded like relief, and something else underneath the relief that was quieter and more careful and felt almost like pride. Not in the outcome. In me. My mother took longer. She called in April, on a Tuesday evening, and asked if she could ask me something. I said, of course. She said, "Did she talk to you about us? About your father and me?" I said, "She talked about family. About what she wanted the property to be. She didn't speak against anyone specifically." My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about those drives. Every other weekend for 7 years. I didn't understand it. I told myself it was just your personality. That you were the responsible one, the serious one, and this was just what you did. I didn't say anything." She said, "It didn't occur to me to wonder if you actually wanted to be there. If she was giving you something the rest of us weren't looking for. I said she was. She said, "What was it?" I thought about the coffee and the table and the morning light and the way Dot asked questions and then actually stayed quiet long enough to hear the answers. I said, "She saw me. She paid attention. She asked about my work and remembered what I said and asked about it the next time." She made me feel like my life was worth being curious about. My mother was quiet for a long time, long enough that I checked to make sure the call was still connected. Then she said, "I didn't do that for you, did I?" It was not a question. It was the slow arriving kind of statement that you make when you have been circling something for a long time and have finally decided, or finally been forced, to land. I said, "Not often." "No." She said, "I'm sorry, Claire." I said, "I know." And then, because it was genuinely true, I said, "There's still time, Mom." That call ended differently than I had expected it to. I sat in my kitchen afterward, not analyzing it, just sitting with it. Something had opened in that conversation that had not been open before. Small and careful and tentative, the way things open when they have been closed for a long time. I didn't know yet what would grow in that space. But I was, for the first time in a long time, willing to find out. I want to talk to you directly now, wherever you are. Whatever time it is, there. I did not set out to be the one Dot trusted. I did not visit her on a strategy. I showed up because I wanted to show up. Because she was worth the drive. Because sitting at that kitchen table on Saturday mornings, looking at the lake with a woman who genuinely cared what I thought, was worth 2.5 hours each way on a highway past cornfields and gas stations and the long flat stretch that always smelled like pine and cold water. That is the entire story. Everything else followed from that single, simple fact. I think sometimes we believe that being seen is something we have to earn. That if we achieve enough, present well enough, become impressive enough in the right ways, the people we want to notice us will finally notice. And sometimes that is true. But I think more often, being seen is something that happens between two people who have both independently made the decision to pay attention to each other. Dot made that decision. I made it too. Everything that followed was the compounded result of both of us keeping that agreement for 7 years. The lake house is open this summer for the first time under the new agreement. My father and mother are going up in July, their first time at the property in 3 years. Brendan is bringing his family in August. Gerald has not confirmed or declined. I will be there in June, alone for the first week, the way I want my first real stay as a steward to be. I will sit in her chair on the porch with the faded blue cushion. I will drink Earl Grey, the blend she kept in the second cabinet, the one she brought out only for people she wanted to linger. I will look at the lake. I will watch the light move across the water the way I watched it with her for 7 years. And I will feel the weight of being trusted, and I will try, every day, to be worthy of it. A boundary is not a wall. What Dot built was not a wall. It was a gate with a lock, and she put the key in the hands of the person she had watched, over 7 years of Saturday mornings, treat everything she loved with the particular care that comes from genuinely loving it yourself. I am keeping the key. And if there is someone in your life right now who pays attention, who asks questions and then waits for the answers, who shows up in February when the roads are icy because they said they would, and their word means something, I want you to understand that kind of person is rare. Rarer than any estate or portfolio or lakeside property with a view worth seeing. And if you are lucky enough to have one, pay them back the only way that ever actually counts. Show up for them. That's the family ledger. And that's today's story. If this reached you, if something in it landed somewhere real, leave me a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And tell me whether you've ever been the one who kept showing up when everyone else stopped. I read every single one. Subscribe if you want to hear the next story. It comes out every week. And check the description for another one I think you'll connect with. Thank you for being here. Really. It means more than you know.